in reverse order of the in which the panel is going to tackle the question of what it means to prepare for doctoral studies. What questions does one or should one ask as one prepares for that possibility? Let me introduce our panel then. Dr. Sean McDonough, professor of New Testament. Many of you know him as that delightful faculty member most interested in apocalyptic stuff. Many of you are taking the book of Revelation with him this semester. He's also expertise across the canon and the Johannine materials, the life of Jesus, a very popular course. He came to us from the Fiji Islands, actually, though he's a native Bostonian in many ways, having taught at Pacific Theological College there in Fiji prior to coming here in 2000. His own doctoral studies were at the University of St. Andrews, and he is a Gordon-Conwell alum, so he sat in your seat once upon a time and wrestled with these questions of what questions he ought to ask as he thinks about doctoral studies. He's written widely, Creation and New Creation. The most significant of his recent works has created quite a bit. He lives with his wife here in Hamilton. They have 4 children, many scattered across the 4 winds of the U.S. He's active in ministry at Hamilton Congregational Church, a pretty frequent preacher of late as well. And most days you'll see him, or at least often, with a baseball cap on, signifying deep Boston sports loyalties. Dr. Kateryna Kuzubova, assistant professor of counseling, our newest member of the panel, originally, as you might know, from Ukraine, and received her BA there in Christian leadership, and for a long time served on university staff in the Ukraine, speaking both Russian, Ukrainian, and English now, her new mother tongue in her time here in the States. She came to the U.S. Through some missionary contacts from Park Street Church, and so spent considerable time here in Boston before heading off to her own doctoral studies in the University of Toledo in counselor education. She's worked in mental health agencies. She's worked in pastoral care clinics, children and adolescents, and family dysfunctions. She has taught at UMass Boston and joined us here at Gordon-Conwell just last academic year. And so Kateryna will go second. Then Adonis Vidu, professor of theology, arrived here at Gordon-Conwell in 2008 from his home country of Romania, where he had taught both at the University of Bucharest as well as Emmanuel University. His PhD, like Professor McDonough's, is an English PhD, a very different kind of format than the American PhD system from the University of Nottingham. Adonis, as many of you know, not only teaches in the general theological requirements area here, but also a specialization in constructive theology, trying to recover patristic and medieval voices in and for the life of the church. And one of those wonderful experiences he's had, and maybe he'll talk about it, he's also taught in the Doctor of Ministry program, another form of doctoral work that many of you are thinking about as well. Adonis is married and with the daughter Hannah, an elder at Grace Chapel in Lexington. So I'll ask them to come up. Adonis is going to go first, then Kateryna, and then Sean. And we've just asked them to share a little bit about what questions, what experiences that were important to them as they thought through their own doctoral experiences. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. Hopefully they're going to tackle the questions from a variety of angles, and you can poke in on the questions and or follow up afterwards. So first to Adonis, and then Kateryna, and finally to Sean.
Well, hi everyone. It's great to see so many people here. I'm pleasantly surprised that there's so much interest in doctoral studies. For some reason, I did not expect there to be so much interest in doctoral studies here, but I'm delighted that we do have this interest. So I'm going to take about 7 or 10 minutes or so to touch on a number of issues that might interest some of you. First of all, the first thing I want to touch on is on this notion of being a doctor, which I have thought about recently because I had heard Professor Oliver Crisp at Fuller reflecting on his own vocation, and he used this category of a doctor of the church to reflect on his own sense of calling as a teacher in the church, having been a pastor and no longer pastoring, but now it's just a teacher. And he used this category of a doctor of the church, and I thought, that's great. That's what I am too. That's how I can think about my own teaching, because I'm not a pastor. I'm an elder, so I'm very involved in the church, but not from a position of a pastor. So, you know, if you do desire to be a doctor of the church, you do desire a noble and good task. You are thinking about a noble and good kind of work, and I think this is one of the things that God actually can place a calling in your own life, to see yourself as a teacher in the church. I think it's wonderful if teachers are also pastors, but if not, being a teacher is a phenomenal calling which you may already sense in your life. So I'm assuming that maybe some of you are struggling with that or thinking about that calling. And the first question I want to touch on in relation to this is, how can you know? How can you know that you have that calling? How can you know that you perhaps should seriously pursue a doctoral program? So I want to touch on 3 or 4 maybe types of criteria you might use, you might think about. The first one has to do with the first criterion: emotional stability, spiritual maturity, responsible management of time. That's the first thing that I noted here, right? And I see some of you perhaps are thinking, okay, maybe this is not exactly for me, responsible management of time. But really, you really have to think seriously. If you're struggling in that field, a PhD is going to place some very serious demands on your time. And especially if you have a family, you have to be very, very, very serious about how you balance that family time and your PhD time. And this does not apply just to PhD work. It applies to whatever work you might be doing. But emotional stability is a big deal. And maybe Katya can speak more about that. So I'm just going to pass it on to her when her time comes. The second thing I want to mention here is internal calling, a sense of internal calling. And in other words, do you daydream about this? Is this the thing you would do more than anything else? I mean, if you're not completely passionate about this, then you may want to think about something else, because again, it's going to place a lot of demands on you. External validation, it would be the third one. Are you getting the absolute best grades, right? Reasonably speaking. Do you know you're good at what you're doing? Are people telling you that you're good at what you're doing? Are you writing good papers? And so on. So and you'll see, because of what I'm going to say at the next point, the next big point, why this is so important. And finally, are professors encouraging you to do this? Are they validating this? So in other words, not just the objective GPA, right, or something like that, which is not always perfectly indicative of one's ability as a scholar or as a future scholar. Sometimes it's more indicative of other things. Maybe you went to the easier classes. Maybe you found the kind of a trajectory that suits you well. So it's not always the best, the only indicator. In other words, you can be a top scholar, but your GPA is not the top GPA. So I wouldn't take that as a kind of an absolute kind of criteria, but together with all these other criterions. So those are the kind of criteria that I would be looking into before I know if I want to pursue this. Now, the next point I want to touch on might feel a little bit of a downer. And I want to give you some numbers here, because looking for a PhD means that you think you're going to be able to find a job after you're done with your PhD work. So I did a quick search here, and I went to the ATS website, the Association of Theological Schools, and the numbers I found there were truly interesting. In 2017, there were 3,907 THD/PhD candidates enrolled in ATS schools. Right, that's almost 4,000 candidates enrolled, right, in ATS schools. So you have to really, think very carefully as to whether the likelihood of finding a job with a PhD is something you need to be ready for that, right? So I put this on the web on my Facebook, and I got some interesting conversation going on about that. And I asked, how many of these do you think are actually looking for a job right now? And the fact is that you have a lot of people on the market looking for jobs. My friend Greg Allison at Southern Seminary writes me that he has heard that for the faculty opening in New Testament studies at Trinity Evangelical Divinity Schools, there were 900 resumes sent in for consideration. Right, so that's, right, these are just some numbers. Part of the same search, somebody posted this comment referring to an article by Peter Enns. I'm not exactly sure what Pete Enns teaches now. I think it's probably Eastern University. And he says, and I'm quoting from Enns, he says, "Folks, there are too many people out there with earned doctorates in Bible and theology. There would never be enough," and he underlines never, "be enough jobs to accommodate the numbers. Schools are cutting or downsizing programs, but the PhD conveyor belt keeps moving along at a steady clip as if everything is just peachy." Right? So he thinks that schools have a responsibility of warning people about this situation, and I guess I'm fulfilling that responsibility now. We don't have a PhD program here, so in a sense we're off the hook. But we do prepare people who think about doing PhD, so you want to consider that. But that doesn't mean it's all bleak in my view, because I actually happen to think, and this is my final point, that there's a future for PhD students not only in the academia, but as pastors as well. I'm a firm believer in PhD work for those of you who are considering the pastoral ministry. I think that for those kinds of students, maybe certain PhD programs would not necessarily be the best choice, but there are different types of PhD programs out there, right? So I think some of the PhD work that's being done at evangelical institutions would be phenomenal places for you to consider, like Trinity, Wheaton, Southern Seminary, and so on. All these places that are really doing solid scholarship out there. They're not going to have the name resonance of a Duke or a Harvard or a University of St. Andrews or Nottingham or something like that, but they're going to be excellent preparation. So I really believe in that. Teaching in a majority world institution is also another option, perhaps connected with a missions appointment or appointment with a missionary agency or something like that. Working in the publishing industry is also an opportunity as well. But just think seriously about where you see yourself and what are the odds of you actually getting there once your PhD studies are done. So sorry for being so bleak, but that's why I go first, and then these guys are going to fix it. Thanks.
Well, I'm not sure about emotional how, because now I'm having to take disorder. Well, thank you so much for opening us. And I think I'm going to speak a little bit more about the practical aspect of PhD. First of all, in America, they say it takes a village to raise a child. I would say it takes a village to graduate with PhD. So if you look at the data, not everybody who starts ends well and graduates. And so this is something that to consider. And I think this has been very, very important for me. And I would say when you are right now thinking about going into PhD, First of all, it's really important to have a spiritual support, spiritual group, people who may not have PhD themselves, but who are on their knees praying for you and helping you to navigate that aspect, whether you should or shouldn't go. But there's another aspect of support that you need to find mentors. And as soon as you find mentors is better. So look for mentors right now in the degrees that you're interested. So if you want to go and study psychology, find a mentor, whether here on campus who is a professor or some other people outside who teach in the secular schools who have PhD in that field. Because that's really, really important. Because people who don't have PhD, they would not understand the difficulties that you're going through and would not help you to navigate the system while you're already doing that. So having support is really, really crucial. And especially, I graduated with PhD from secular school. So it's really, really important to have both of those supports, mentorship and spiritual support, and again, like mentors, secular mentors and Christian mentors, where something that you can speak with secular people and something you can actually speak only with people who are mentors who share the faith. So that's really been important for me because PhD in a secular program challenges you quite a bit, especially I came with my undergrad and my master's program. Both schools had Christian in their title. And so even I remember one time I was sitting and we were doing CV reviews, and one of the students told me, well, maybe if you want to get a job in a secular school, you should, instead of Cincinnati Christian University, say Cincinnati University. But I was like, I cannot do that. So when people find out that you're Christian, it's a little different game, especially again, like if you are doing your degree in psychology or counseling where no, you need to be politically correct quite a bit. So you need to learn how to speak about the different terms as well. So I think Dr. Vidu mentioned quite a bit about motivation. So why do you want to be a doctor? If you think you're going to make a lot of money, forget about that. If you think you are going to be, no, if you want your family to call you a doctor, well, you can demand that. But at the end of the day, if you just want to be who you are, you don't need to be a doctor. So really look at the motivation. Why do you want to be a doctor? And in my experience, I found there's different types of motivations. There's intrinsic motivation, which works the best. And there is also motivation that comes from the outside, like you want to prove your family that you achieved. Or you want to make more money, or any other motivation. So depending on what motivation you have, it will actually help you to succeed or fail as you go through the program. I think Dr. Vidu also mentioned quite a bit about values, what is important, and I think that's also when you're considering for applying for a PhD program, it's important to look like what is important for you. So why do you want to do it, and what's important for you? Like for me personally, having flexibility was huge, and I think I'm millennium, so all of us want to work from home and and have flexibility be our own boss. And this is where I was thinking that being a woman, having flexibility was really important. And so I figured out if I have only masters in counseling, the only thing I can do just either do private practice or work for the state agency, which I actually need to be on time. I will need to work with babysitters and everything, and so it would be more challenging. Well, when I get PhD, and at the time I could do that, I was like, well, I could do research, I could teach, I could be adjunct, I could be full professor. Depending on my circumstances, I have more options and have more flexibility. So that was very attractive to me. And that's where where I start thinking about why I want to pursue that. So what's your values? What is important? And other thing I want to mention about grades are not important. What's important just to pass the classes and defend the dissertation. Hopefully, if you don't expecting to get second master's after PhD or another PhD, nobody really cares about your GPA. I mean, nobody asked me here what my GPA was. I mean, do the best, but at the same time, if you have family, don't don't neglect and don't devalue that aspect, children and family in your life. So as long as you pass, as long as you get the concepts, as long as you know how to find the sources and do well, then you do well. You will do well. Anyway, you're going to be a BA student anyway. So again, grades are not important. At least it wasn't important for me. And there is, I think, another aspect where I want to speak about strategies and accountability. So, so before you get into the PhD program, kind of as you consider and start searching, it's important to have a strategy. So in America, you work smart, not hard, even though you work hard still, but have a strategy. So like for instance, right now, if you're interested in working with addictions, well, then take the classes in addictions, do the papers on addictions, every single possibility that you have, and do research on that topic. Now, if you are interested in a doctrine of rest, well, then, or spiritual growth, then do all your papers on that topic right now. So do research, because when you go in for interview, you want to show that you know what you're talking about. So really work smart in some way that kind of put all this interest as soon as you start developing them in one direction. So it's like one of the aspects with a strategist. Then another one strategy is, again, so based on your values, based on your motivation, look at the acceptance rate, look at kind of, I know, do psychologists make more than counselors? And what similarities, what differences, kind of what options you have, what acceptance rate in different schools, and do you really need to go to Harvard and get PhD from Harvard? And again, for what? Like why are you motivated to go to Harvard instead of, University of Toledo, for instance? So definitely, like, kind of as you search and be strategic about that. Also, it's very important to look at the pay. I know culture plays a role. For me, money was a huge issue. So for me, if I didn't have money, it means I don't go to school. So I couldn't take a loan as international, and I quite frankly didn't know how to live in debt. So for me, this has created so much anxiety, existential anxiety, so I cannot take a loan. Personally, and also I couldn't do that. And so that's another aspect where you look at schools. Majority of the PhD programs would have scholarship that will actually cover a full tuition for your work. So basically, what the benefit of that, and I think there's a kind of, you kill a bird with two birds with one stone. So the benefit of it is where you basically work as a teaching assistant or doing research or teaching or some clinical work, and your tuition get covered fully, which is huge. And also you get a stipend, which you can maybe survive or at least supplement. But also another benefit is, well, you work for a university. You basically work part-time for a university. You put on your CV, you have years of experience. So teaching you're doing, research you're doing, clinical work you're doing is actually a part of your job. So you're working and studying basically at the same time. So you actually have more experience and better prospects to get a job. So you're going to compete with others. Another aspect where you actually really need to know what's going on in your field and how to get the job, like what's really important. Because I think it's not working anymore as you focus on studying and then you start working. You kind of need to work and study at the same time, because what I realized that by the time I graduate, my peers published books, published 5 articles plus, and had all the licensure under their belt. And so I was competing with the same age, with the same graduation year, but our experiences weren't comparable. And so this is where like you want to also kind of see where you are there. And there's another strategy and accountability, I would say, that when you go into PhD, you don't do it from the romantic reason, like, oh, would be such a wonderful thing to be a doctor. It's kind of a business project. So this is where I say it's really important to have support, mentorship, and strategy, how you're going to end. So it's important to have a timeline, because life will happen and will actually steer you away for various reasons, but also it's important to be organized and have a timeline and have accountability, especially as you start dissertation process. Because usually when you take classes, you have other peers and they support you. You talk to your colleagues, to other professors. But when you start dissertation, you're basically by yourself. You're by yourself, and it's a very lonely process. And and if you don't have mentors who understand you, it's even more lonely. So definitely have accountability. So get those people and develop the plan. For me, what worked actually, I call my thesis as a pregnancy because it took me 9 months. And so it has actually stages where women who have kids or who learn about that can talk about. So first 3 months you feel nauseous. You feel nauseous because you even don't know where to begin. You open up all the research databases and you get overwhelmed. You want to shut down. And don't forget you still need to leave. So you have family, job, and everything. So you basically go to work at 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. after a dinner, get yourself and open the book or open the article. It doesn't make sense to you. So you feel nauseous, and then finally there is like kind of, you hear the heartbeat of the child, and it's like, yeah, I have this idea, I have the basically hypothesis. I think I know what I'm going to do. I think I got that question I want to answer. And so especially when your advisor says, yeah, you're there, so now you can develop and all this stuff. And so this is where you start working hard, and at 6 months basically, so usually it took me 6 months basically to write my first 3 chapters, and for normal situations, I propose to my faculty when it's basically where you go through a proposal and they say yes, you develop your methods, everything sounds great, so now you actually get into data, you can do that, and then write the results, and then write discussion. And so this is where basically another 3 months where you kind of be done and to completely defend and to be done with that. So, but for me, what helped actually to do this thing in 9 months, or maybe it takes a year or 2, depends on the degree, to develop the plan. And so I was really grateful that my advisor was really nice about that compared to maybe some. So every week we actually had a Skype interview. Skype meeting, and so I knew that by the time I talked to him, at least I needed to change 2 sentences, because otherwise I would feel guilty to come and say, well, I haven't done anything. And so that really pushed me and helped me every single week to make at least half of that page, 1 page, 2 page progress. And so that was really crucial. Otherwise I wouldn't have done that. Yeah, I think I'm about to be done. So my advisor told me before I started, he said, like, Katya, having a PhD like having a child. You're never ready for it, but once you have it, you never regret. And I would say this is very much true.
That's great.
Okay, we've had good principles, so I'm just going to tell my story, and the principles will, we trust, be woven into the narrative. So a little over 30 years ago, I started at Gordon-Conwell because I wanted to do ministry in the vaguest possible sense. And I literally didn't think I had very much to learn because I was such a moron. But I thought, I read the Bible, I read some Puritan paperbacks, what more could there be? So I quickly learned how little I knew, but it was actually a joy. And I would sit in class, and I just loved every minute of it. Sit with Dr. Lintz or whomever, and I'd just sit there and smile and think, I just love this. This is so awesome. I'm learning so much. And I furthermore realized I wasn't really particularly good at anything else, so this looked like a good career path. So I went in and talked to Dr. Greg Beale, New Testament professor, now at Westminster, and literally the same desk that I sit behind now, I sat opposite. And I said, well, I'm thinking of doing a PhD, and should I switch from, I was in the MDiv, because that was the degree I bumbled into to do ministry. I said, should I switch to a master's? And in his inimitable style, he says, I'd do the MDiv, and then I'd do the THM, and then I'd do the PhD. And he said exactly like this. Rick knows exactly what I'm talking about. So I thought, all right, that was pretty firm. Again, so delighted I did the MDiv, benefited from all the things I took, the preaching, the mentored ministry. It's all made material contributions to my present profession. And I began to, as has been indicated, to specialize, although I took plenty of missions courses as well, but began to burrow down into New Testament stuff, did the MDiv, did the PhD, did the THM, and began writing to Britain to see about a PhD. Now, the British system's quite different. You don't technically have any classes. Did you have to take any taught classes? No, neither did I. Partly because I'd logged so much time in the classroom already, I didn't feel a particular burden to have to do that again. So you spend 3 years writing your dissertation. Dr. Beale recommended, because I was interested in the book of Revelation, studying either with Richard Bauckham at St. Andrews, which is in Scotland, which is not in England, so it's a Scottish PhD, but I forgive those who have mislabeled it. John Sweet at Cambridge, whom Beale had studied with, I wrote to both of them, literally wrote to them, as we did back in the day. Sweet wrote back and said, well, I'm kind of retiring, I'm going to go to New Zealand. You should study with Bauckham up in St. Andrews. I thought, okay. And he wasn't the megawatt star that he is now. He's relatively unknown, having taught theology, essentially, for a long time at Manchester. Getting in was not much of a problem, and typically it's easier to get into the British PhDs. It's just harder to pay for them. So we did face a financial question. My wife was pregnant with our first child, and vividly remember being in C building and having no money to do the PhD. And I would love to call it a prayer of faith, kind of Joshua-like or something. It was more like a banging my spoon on the table, like, I have no future, God, what am I going to do? And at that point, I think we needed $5,000 because I'd got a scholarship from the British government, but we're $5,000 short, so I banged my spoon on the table. And the very next morning, got a call from a church we were associated with offering $5,000, just out of the blue. So my wife got a job there in St. Andrews, remarkably. So we do say God dropped money out of the sky. I'm not saying that's an action plan for you, but it was the case for us. And it is the case that you do need to always entrust your ways to the Lord and trust in His provision. I mean, you make plans, you do what you can, but ultimately you need to walk in faith, not to even outgloom Dr. Vidu. You're going to die at some point, and your Christian faith, you say, God's going to raise me bodily from the dead, right? You all believe that. If you're not, you don't have the name of a Christian. Well, if you believe that, then to trust Him to provide for X thousands of dollars for your PhD, should He desire that you do it, which gets back to the question of motivation and calling and all the rest of it. He can do as He pleases, and there's no shortfall in His resources. So PhD itself went quite swimmingly. I had a topic all lined up, use of Zechariah in Revelation. I got in to Baukham's office, and he said, well, you could do that, but what about this business of the divine name in Revelation 1:4? And I'm thinking, he knows what he's talking about, so yeah, I'm on board. And it was awesome. I just had a blast. We had, Siobhan was born in January, our first year there in St. Andrews, and then Patrick came along 2 years later, so that was a lot to handle. I still just loved the work itself, so I'm very atypical in that regard. It was just a lot of fun and kind of a break from watching the kids and changing diapers and the rest of it. Or nappies, as we should say. So then there was a matter of getting a job. I applied to 50. I just about finished. And applied to 50 places and got rejected from all of them, including the job in Fiji, which I eventually got because they offered it to somebody else, and then that person declined. And we had a strong sense we were meant to have that, and we're not hyper spiritual. We just thought, boy, that seems like the right place for us. And then we got the news, and we're all sad. Hopefully my spoon banging days were over at that point, but we entrusted it to the Lord, and He sent us out there to the Pacific for 3 years, and then, not least through the ministrations of Greg Beale before his departure, he helped me to get this job, and so that part of the tale ends. I think I've kept in most of the salient details, but I want to give people opportunity to ask questions.
Thank you. Let's open up for Q&A as practical or as abstract as you would like to get. You've got some wonderful resources here in front of you. Don't be afraid. Some questions might be quite personal and you can follow up afterwards, but some might be more public. We always say questions, not sermons. And so who wants to start us off? There's some microphones around so everybody can hear. Jess, right down front here.
For Dr. McDonough and Dr. Veedu, how did God prepare your spouse for the idea and then the preparation of going into a PhD? What did that look like for each of you?
Well, I can't tell you exactly how God did it, but objectively speaking, we were fortunate enough for my wife to complete a master's degree also. We had just gotten married in the year 2000, and this was 1 year into my PhD program, and I had about 2.5 more years to go, and one of those 2.5 years that we were together in the UK, she was busy with a master's program of her own in international law. So that was something that made it easier, I guess, in many ways, and it was just a wonderful time. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think for us, we'd always been interested in missions. In fact, we did the OMP in Indonesia for one summer. So the idea of, and my wife's from Hawaii, so she'd already transplanted out here. So the mobility wasn't as critical a question. And it's certainly a wonderful and great sacrifice on her part to sacrifice her engineering career, at least for a time. Now, we're also very committed to family and kids. So once the baby was on the way, that she was committed to being with her. So that was not a huge barrier in the sense that step, was already going to be taken, that she'd leave the workforce for a while. And by God's providence, we got back from Fiji. She was able to get a lot of part-time stuff. And then once our youngest son went off to school, she was able to get back to GE Aviation where she works now. So it was a nice, happy ending. And now she's got a wonderful career in making jet engines and helicopter engines, all sorts of other things.
Another?
Just interpreting from some things that you said, so the British one doesn't have classes. Is there any, so maybe in the American system as well as the British system, what does the general structure look like? So for somebody that knows nothing about doctoral studies, so you get there, are there classes, or is it pretty much, because all I've heard is that you pretty much just kind of do research on your own and are trying to investigate into a topic. So could you just give some structure of what it looks like in various systems, please?
You're the only one who knows the
Yeah,
American
so,
system.
I know the British system. Katya knows the American system, so why don't you go?
Yeah, I know American, but not theological system. So I don't know how much it's going to be useful. So basically, I had to take 60 credits, which is included 15 credits of dissertation. So it's about 45 credits you're taking in my program for as a classes. And so what actually, different programs are very different, but by vast majority, dissertation is the last thing. So what I actually been doing, I've been taking 15 credits every semester. So I had an advisor. I was kind of doing my dissertation, but not really doing, but I was taking the credits because the price was the same. So I was like trying to figure out the financial piece as well, because that was very important. I couldn't afford it on my own out of pocket. And so so basically it took 2 years to take the classes. And then after, I was really fortunate with my, again, department who let me come back to Boston, and I was working here on CPT because I'm also international and I have visa issues that I need to take care of that too. So I was working part-time at CPT and doing my dissertation actually online, like via distance. So this is why we had Skype meetings every week. And actually I was, so basically that's kind of worked for me. I don't know how it's for other programs. I mean, kind of if they are structured differently. I don't know if somebody in theology who I have done in America and who has PhD could speak more
the
about
kind of
that.
standard residential American program, 2 years of coursework, a year of exams, doctoral exams in different related fields, and then a year or 2 or 3 for the dissertation. That's kind of a paradigm. Now, things are mutating in the PhD world. So you surely want to investigate, and you can investigate so much of this set of structures online nowadays. Also, that there are increasing number of the UK doctoral programs, really European universities more generally, that are non-residential, have a non-residential option as well. They love the American money to come, and so one of the ways they've attracted students to come without coming is to devise these non-residential online programs where you're in residence only 6 weeks out of the year at some of the universities in the UK. So that structure as well, though still like the programs that Adonis and Sean were part of, is oriented all towards that final production of a dissertation. Whereas the American coursework is more of a generalist approach, 2 years of general coursework, a year of exams, and then a year to write the dissertation. That's the normal pattern. Katya?
I'd also add, make sure that what's the time limit, how long you can do
Right.
that. So in my program, it was 7 years. So if within 7 years I didn't defend, I would need to start coursework from the beginning. So that's where you cannot actually start and feel like you can retire and then defend. So it doesn't work this way. So if there's a cap limit, which many programs actually do right now, again, I don't know about theology, so make sure that you plan it, because that's where most people actually go through the classes, but then the dissertation part where it doesn't get done.
Joe?
Hi, yes, I have a question from a viewer online. It is, how can an American PhD student afford to pursue a PhD studies in the UK with a family and without taking student loans? And as such, we will not have any follow-up questions. And that is specifically for Dr. McDonough.
Yeah, I mean, there are scholarships available at some universities. St. Andrews is always trying to coax money up to help support students. I don't know that they have the overseas research scheme anymore, which was, I was on that. Churches, again, there is definitely an aspect of faith to it. One of my favorite expressions, though, is if there's no solution, there's no problem. So if you don't have the money, you can't go, and you take that as a providential direction that, at least for the time being, you should be doing something else with your life. So there, as I said, you can beat the bushes. Scholarships do exist at churches and institutions and some universities, but you're going to have to work hard to drum those out. Now, the tuition costs and the cost of living, well, the cost of living tends to even out because things are a little more expensive, but they tend to live a bit more of a Spartan existence over there in the British Isles. But tuition tends to be, I think, a little lower, if I'm not mistaken. So
I'm wondering about what are some intrinsic qualities that are needed when you're discerning calling? So obviously, love of what you're learning, just drinking it all up. But I think I've wondered about that. And then also, are there different types of scholars that you could see? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can address a little bit of this. I mean, just a part of this. And I'll start with the last thing you said. There are different types of scholars. I think that's absolutely right. I think that a pastor can be a scholar if we have a broader definition of scholarship. Probably a pastor is not going to be able to write this many books or this many articles or present at so many conferences, but can still apply his theological knowledge either in the actual work of proclamation or in some written work in a way that I would say must qualify as scholarship. There are scholars who are excellent teachers, and then there are scholars who are not so good teachers. I don't think that, which doesn't mean that one is any less of a scholar than the other. It's just different types of scholarship. To go back just slightly to the earlier question about British versus American PhDs, I did it in the British system, and one of the things that I wish I had more of, I wish I had more classes actually in the British system, because I felt like I was being developed in such a narrow and such a focused kind of way, and I would have liked to have the broader kind of exposure to topics that I normally maybe would not have wanted to study. So that's my part there. So if you're thinking about teaching, are you any good? Are you any good in public speaking? Are you any good in front of students, answering questions? Are you comfortable? So.
I'd also chime in terms of the value of, because you mentioned non-residential, the value of residential education is you do at least peripherally get an expansion of your horizon, so you're mixing in with, in my case, theologians or church historians or whomever, and you just pick up things, even if you're not able to devote time to study them formally. It does rub off on you in a way that won't happen if you just burrowed into your own topic.
Amen.
I can speak on intrinsic motivation in terms like how it worked for me. So I do believe if God gives you a thought and desire, He will make it happen or not. So this is where the faith comes in. And so for me personally, I never wanted to be a doctor. I didn't really care about that compared to my other friends who were in the program. And so, but God gave me those thoughts where my friend was trying recruiting me, and I started having conversations, and I said, well, God, I'm open. I don't know what else can I do. Just lead me, whether give me a job, bring me back to Ukraine and help me to figure out what to do with my counseling degree there, or if this is what I need to do, then just make it happen. And so I applied only to 2 schools, and I say if any of them takes me, I will take it, and if I will have funding, I will take. And I know that if you give me this opportunity, if you give me that you will make it happen. And I feel like for me personally, it's always been like walking in a little bit anxiety by faith. As like, well, I don't know if I can teach. I don't know if I'm good at that. I don't know if I can be a good researcher. But if God gives me this opportunity, I guess maybe people know I hope they know what they're doing. And so I walked through that. So it's been my experience. I don't know if it's applicable to everyone, but I think like for me, that was like internal. If God gives you, then He will make it happen. And also I would say, if not for that, I would actually have given up at my undergraduate degrees, because there was every single time in my life where I wanted to pack the bags and leave and say like, I'm done, it's enough, I'm dying here. But I always knew like if God opened this path, I cannot really interfere with His will, because it's always this image of Jonah in the whale. If I messed up, God will bring me back, but it's going to be more painful. Mm-hmm. So I need to be obedient. So if He makes the path, I should just follow and don't mess up His will until He clearly closes the door, and then I have nothing else to do.
Sure. One more thing in terms of motivation is I've come to realize I think most of what you end up doing in life is 50% divine calling and 50% personal pathology. So, you're always going to have mixed motives. If you only want the shiny robe and people to call you doctor, et cetera, then that's going to be insufficient, and that you'll be chaff blown away by the winds of PhD reality. But if you wait to have a perfect, pure inner disposition, not mixed at all with any less savory motivations, then who really could achieve that. So you just try to be discerning, and of course that personal view is then matched, as was suggested, by external confirmation. That's a critical part, is the discernment of the community, not just your inner sense that this must be the case. Are you in fact competent? Are they willing to put their money where their mouth is? All sorts of external confirmations are equally critical. So try to have as pure motives as you can, but don't imagine you're going to be completely unsullied.
Dennis.
I wonder if I could just make a couple of comments on the American versus European. When I was trying to make my decision, I had to decide between whether I would stay in the U.S. or I'd been accepted at University of London and Aberdeen in Scotland. And knew I wanted to do ethics and had only done several courses in ethics in my seminary work. And so I looked at that and realized for teaching, I really needed to have the coursework. And so that led me to stay in the States. And I think the coursework, along with, and by the way, the coursework is usually 2 or 3 courses a semester. At least that's the way it is in most doctoral programs in the US. Doing that, you have a lot more time to read things you want to read. I just remember many occasions hearing a professor or a fellow student refer to a book, went off to the library and got it and read it. Because with that kind of a structure of fewer courses, you have the time to do it. You don't have that luxury when you're taking 12, 13 hours a semester in seminary. I think a number of the European schools, as I understand it, particularly the British schools, are adding some seminars into the program because they found they weren't having the best results competitively in terms of getting jobs for their students. And the reason was it was so narrowly focused, they could only teach one small slice of the New Testament, and they couldn't teach anything else in the New Testament. And the reality is, if you get a job in an undergraduate program in a college or a Bible college, you're probably going to have to teach more than just one narrow discipline. And if you do work in Johannine work, you're certainly going to have to do a lot more than epistles or the Gospel of John. So I think those are things to keep in mind. The American system, I don't think anybody mentioned this, still formally you often have to work through languages. Typical, and this has begun to change over the last few years, but when I was there you had to do German and French. You had to formally pass exams. I remember going and sitting in my German exam and I was handed 3 pages of Karl Barth. And I had 2.5 hours to translate it. They had to do it. And I remember the time I took it, there were 15 of us that took, and 3 of us passed. Wow. So that was another whole, now they've eased up a bit on that in recent years, but that's another thing to look at. On the European side, it will basically be you need to get the languages to accomplish the dissertation that you're writing. And so it will be more informally defined, and that'll get worked out between you and the dissertation advisor.
Amen. Amen.
I just wanted to thank you guys real quick. I think this has been very encouraging and a balanced sort of approach in that you haven't hidden the hardships from us, but you've also not presented this as something that's insurmountable. Having talked about some of the difficulties of the process and the difficulties of getting a job, can you tell us a little bit about where you're sitting right now? What are some of the good things and what are some of the things that maybe we don't see as students that really suck about being a PhD, having a PhD?
Who wants to go first?
I
don't want to go first.
A little rhetorical flourish there that demands
first thing, pursuant to Dr. Hollinger's comment, which is very valid, but little job advice if you do get your PhD, if they say, and I've had people in interviews who say, you know, can you teach Romans? Well, I'm really a John specialist. If they say, we'd like you to teach Ugaritic and a little modern dance, the only possible reply is absolutely. I feel totally confident I could do that. And then, by God's grace, you go and do it. But don't say, oh no, I can only do this. That's just, 900 resumes, and you're going to say, no, no, you can do anything. Believe in yourself. Yeah. Actually, Ed could do that. So I can offload it. To my seminar, Practicum. I love teaching. I mean, there's really no, not any profound downside to the job if you can get it. It's great. So, yeah, I love it.
It really is a great job. Again, I've never looked back. Probably when you start teaching, it's the amount of course prep at the very beginning that can feel very daunting. So keep whatever lecture notes you can from seminary, or from doctoral work later on, because they're going to come in really handy. But apart from that, I mean, it's a phenomenal line of work, I think. It gives you a lot of flexibility. It's also very fulfilling. It's deeply fulfilling because you're not just speaking about your passions, but you're speaking to people about your passions. And you get to interact with students, and you get to give this kind of advice here. That's can be life changing for people. And that's kind of hard to beat. It can be beaten, but it's kind of hard. So yeah, it's if you feel called, you're never going to regret it.
I would say just really find a university where you enjoy being. And so I would definitely say, compared to other schools I've taught, not many, but still I would say here I really truly enjoy, and I actually enjoy because of the students here, and I actually learn. If in the other schools I felt I needed to give, here actually I feel like being nurtured as well. So I really like this aspect where I have a PhD, but we're actually still humans who learn, and I learned so much from you guys. And so I think that aspect where it actually motivates me and wires my near pathways, so I'm learning constantly. On the other side, probably as Dr. Vidu mentioned, like at the beginning of the career, I'm ready to retire. So I'm talking about to Dr. Polishek, I was like, Dr. Polishek, can I retire with you? Because that's a lot of work. But then people say that it gets better. And I definitely can see that second year is a little bit lighter on the teaching side, but then you get more involved in administration and other things. So I'm hoping that sometime I'm going to juggle those responsibilities lightly, but definitely there's a flexibility. I actually really grateful that in the summer, like for instance, I can go home hopefully for 6 weeks and not to think about school. And I cannot get that anywhere in America like that.
And just, just to give a little sour to the sweet, we do have to go to meetings, some of which are less scintillating than others.
And I'd say the old truism mostly holds true for the breadth of the faculty, that they let us teach for free, but they pay us to grade. The tediousness, but there's also something ironic about that, because it's actually the interaction with students' work that is at the heart of what we're up to. And so there is this, already but not yet eschatology that lies behind that. This is really important to interact. But on this side of paradise, it can be tedious. And so that's at least a part of what I hear as I relate across the breadth of the faculty. One last question, I think there was.
So I'm not a current student here. I graduated MDiv here a number of years ago, and DMin a couple years ago with Adonis. And so I've served in my church as an associate pastor for about 14 years, almost 40. I have 2 kids. My wife works full-time, looking into PhD stuff. And it's like, how do I just practically consider moving for a residential program, right? So looking at modular PhDs or the research PhDs of the European model. So I guess I would just say, in terms of practical life and research and scholarship advice, being where you are now and having gone through the research that you've gone through, having seen a number of students pursue these studies, what advice do you have for people in in our shoes to be asking, to be considering if you were going back? What questions should we be asking outside of what you can just Google?
So, Mike, let me see if I understand your question correctly. Are you asking because you are transitioning back, you've done your doctoral ministry, and now you are in ministry, and now you're thinking maybe you want to go back and do some doctoral work? Is that? I'm not trying to understand the heart of your question.
All right, so my meandering question was, if you're not a recent MDiv grad, and you're not in your 20s anymore, you're kind of middle-aged and looking to get into PhD studies, because I'm assuming there are people on their live stream who can't be here physically to ask the question. If you're kind of in that middle zone and you're trying to figure out how to pursue this, this calling, how would you go about that? Having the responsibilities professionally and personally of someone who's middle-aged.
I mean, I just had a student recently, 5 kids in ministry, slightly younger than yourself, and you know he's gone off and done it. So it's a challenge. You got to really have deep discernment, right? If you're a young person, you're 26 and single, and you can make your choices that don't have a profound effect on everybody else, then you can take more risks. It just stands to reason that the more rooted you are, the more persons who are enmeshed in your decisions, then you've got to have a real strong calling and total buy-in from everyone involved, kids, spouse, etc. Otherwise, you know, stay in your lane, bro. As the tattoo artist in that AT&T commercial says. So yeah, I think just the more complex your life situation is, the higher degree of certainty you need to make that dramatic a move. And so all those things we talk about, intrinsic motivation, external confirmation, financial resources, have to be at 11 versus, yeah, you're a kid, you go out and you give it a shot, it doesn't work out, no big deal. This could be a really big deal. So the one thing I would say is don't try to force the issue if there's not complete buy-in and maybe even a dollop or two of remarkable supernatural signs that you ought to do this. I just think there's a higher ceiling. It's like going on the mission field. You better really know what you're getting into, because it's going to be hard.
I think in Ukraine we say if you're afraid of wolf, you can never go to the forest. So probably if you knew what your life is going to be right now when you were 25, you probably would have maybe decided to have kids and not haven't. So if you, so there is always a risk, and you really need to have that support. So it depends, I think, on person's situation, and you don't need to feel that you need to go full time and take 15 credits every semester. So if there is a way how you can just take one class and it will work out within 7 years or 8 years or 10 years, whatever the time frame is, then just go and do it. If maybe 1 year you have lighter schedule, then you can take more classes. So I think there's, when you kind of go with a grad school, master's and PhD, it's more individualistic based on kind of all the other factors that involved and people involved and resources you have. But I would say if you can be afraid of the wolf and never get out of the house and go to the forest, or you can just, take the faith and just to see what God's going to do in your life.
Yeah, I want to second all that. Just one quick thing here. You have to think about possible outcomes, like what you will want to do with the PhD. And objective situation is, given the market that's out there, and given the life stage at which you are, and given that you would have to start from the from the bottom of the academic kind of position ladder, as it were, it's tough. But if it's for this, if it's for the sake of learning, that's a different situation, But you're realistic enough and to consider all these things. So, in terms of ability to do it, I think you would be maybe at this stage of life you would be much more focused. You'll be much more well-rounded in many ways. Maybe you would be asking much better questions than I was asking at age 25, or others are asking at that age. So, So I definitely have seen people doing PhDs at a much older age than yours, and do it well. So.
And I would actually add some programs and some programs that are competitive only can take one student. They actually tend to take a student who have been out there, worked, have experience, and they definitely know what they want to do, compared to just like a person who just graduated, undergrad, master's, or undergrad and going into PhD. So I wouldn't say that the age is an obstacle. Hopefully not.
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
It's actually more benefit.
Yeah.